Well, hey, Rocky Peak, this is day 2 of our encounter study. And in yesterday's video, we learned that God is not only king over the nation of Israel, but he's king over all of creation. And Andy talked about how God revealed himself to the nation of Israel and assured them that he would be their king forever. Well, this was really put to the test when Israel was exiled from the Promised Land. The first time was in 722 BC when the 10 northern tribes were exiled to Assyria, and then in 586 BC, the 2 southern tribes of Benjamin and Judah were exiled to Babylon. And that's where we are picking up the story of God and his people today. Now, the exile was really one of the biggest spiritual crises in Israel's history, and it really left them wondering, is God still our king? Does he still love us? Does he still have a plan for us? Is he truly still king over the earth? But the Lord had spoken through the prophets. He warned Israel that this could happen. He spoke through Isaiah, Jeremiah, and many other prophets that if they didn't turn from other gods they were worshiping, if they didn't stop sinning, if they didn't leave their evil practices, that they would lose the promised land. And I want to read to you just really quick from Jeremiah 25. These are verses 8 and 9, and it says, "Therefore the Lord Almighty says this, because you have not listened to my words, I will summon all the peoples of the north and my servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, declares the Lord, and I will bring them against this land and its inhabitants and against all the surrounding nations." Then in verse 11, he says, "This whole country will become a desolate wasteland, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. And what's so fascinating about this is that God uses Nebuchadnezzar, a pagan king, to carry out his plans and purposes for his people. So this king does deport these exiles to Babylon, and he eventually destroys Jerusalem and the temple. But it's in this context that God raises up this incredible leader. His name is Daniel, and he's a Jew. He's one of the first to be deported from Jerusalem to Babylon, but in 605 BC, before the fall of Jerusalem. And through a series of incredible events, Daniel raises up to be just a top leader and advisor to King Nebuchadnezzar and many other kings that came after him. And I really believe this is due so much to the fact that Daniel was so faithful in such a pagan context. Now, what you're going to be reading today is a story about Nebuchadnezzar. And that's found in Daniel chapter 4. And the book of Daniel actually begins with a brief overview of the fall of Jerusalem and its destruction, but then it quickly shifts its focus to Daniel and his 3 friends. So by chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar has already learned so much about God. So much has transpired. He has learned that God is a revealer of mysteries, that he has power. He's seen his power at work, and he has experienced the truth of God. He's heard it, but he just hasn't accepted it. And so Nebuchadnezzar has an initial dream that Daniel interprets. And this is what Daniel says. It's in chapter 2:37, Daniel reveals to Nebuchadnezzar that it's actually the God of heaven that has given him dominion, power, glory, and might. But Nebuchadnezzar still doesn't get it. So now we're in chapter 4, which you're going to be reading today, and he has another dream, and God reveals this warning to Nebuchadnezzar. And so after the dream interpretation, Daniel, being the good advisor that he is, gives Nebuchadnezzar this advice. And so here's what he says in verse 27 of chapter 4. He says, "Therefore, your majesty, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that your prosperity will continue." But Nebuchadnezzar still doesn't do it. He doesn't listen to that advice. And so 12 months later, he's roaming about his palace, and he says this in verse 30. He said, "Is this not the great Babylon that I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power for the glory of my majesty?" Well, that was it. That was the final straw for God. And so God brings this decree upon Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is stripped of all of his power and he's sent away from his people. And through this trial, he actually finally surrenders to the authority of God, and he bends his knee to King over the world. And here's what he discovers, and I'm going to read from verses 34 and 35. He says, "At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and I glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, what have you done?" So did you hear that? God does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. So Nebuchadnezzar has really discovered who the true king is. Now, this story that I've recounted really reminds me of a time in my own life when God brought me to a place of deeper surrender, and it was really during the season of COVID-19. And that was a time when the nations were completely shut down, and it was completely out of our control. And it was due to a virus. And yet God used this season to bring me to a place of surrender, because I was dealing with such extreme anxiety during this situation over just what my future was, the future of my family. And when I surrendered fully to him in a deeper way, God revealed to me that I'd been placing my hope and trust in the wrong things, that I'd been placing my hope and trust in man and not in God. And through that season, I just grew to trust him more fully. I grew in my faith and really surrendered and accepted and received God's peace and comfort over my life. So I just hope and pray that during this week that you'll grow in that truth, that you'll grow in your trust and faith in God, that he is ruling over your life as Lord and King, and that he is ruling over the nations as well as Lord and King, and that he is in control. God bless.